You know that feeling when you're sitting in a doctor's waiting room, and they call out the name of someone who's been there longer than you, and that person just doesn't come back? Yeah, that's exactly the vibe in the corridor outside Testing Chamber Omega-7 at the Galactic Academy for Advanced Cognitive Sciences. The place looked like someone had taken a university hallway and decided it needed more floating crystals and ominous humming. Students from across the galaxy huddled in groups, whispering in languages that ranged from melodic chirping to what sounded like someone gargling gravel. They were all here for the same reason: the mind maze test, the examination that made grown Zelthorians weep purple tears and caused Regillian honor warriors to seriously consider career changes in food service. Zephyr, a nervous bundle of tentacles from the Andromeda spiral, was currently wrapped around himself so tightly he looked like a very anxious pretzel. His 3 eyes darted between his study notes and the chamber door, which had been sealed shut for the past 47 minutes. The last student to enter had been Grex the Mighty, a specimen so intellectually gifted that his brain had its own gravitational field. That was 2 hours ago. The door had opened once since then, just long enough for a maintenance drone to wheel out what looked suspiciously like a drooling catatonic heap that might have once been Grex. "I heard," whispered Korak, a 7-foot-tall warrior scholar whose biceps had their own biceps, "that the mind maze doesn't just test your intelligence, it tests your soul. It finds your deepest fears, your darkest secrets, and then makes you solve calculus problems while experiencing them." Nixie, whose crystalline form was currently cycling through colors that didn't have names in most languages, chimed in with a sound of wind through a very expensive chandelier. "My pod sister attempted the test last semester. She's now working at a sandwich shop on Kepler 442b, and she can only count to purple." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of someone who clearly hadn't gotten the memo about the appropriate level of existential dread. Jake Thompson, the exchange student from a little backwater planet called Earth, strolled up to the group with all the casual confidence of someone heading to a particularly easy pop quiz. He was carrying what appeared to be a bag of some kind of primitive Earth snack, and had somehow managed to look completely relaxed, despite being surrounded by the academic equivalent of a black hole. "Hey guys," Jake said, settling down next to the group with the kind of easy familiarity that made hardened space marines uncomfortable. "Anyone know if we're allowed to bring pencils in there? I mean, I know it's some kind of psychic thing, but old habits, you know." The collective silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a meditation aid. Zephyr's tentacles froze mid-writhe. Korak's jaw dropped so far it practically required its own zip code. Even Nixie's color cycling stuttered to a confused beige. "You do realize," Korak said slowly, as if explaining to a very small child, "that this is the mind maze test? The examination with a pass rate lower than the survival rate of a black hole picnic?" Jake munched thoughtfully on what looked like some kind of processed grain product covered in artificial cheese dust. "Yeah, I read the syllabus, sounds tricky. But hey, how hard can it be, right?" And that's when everyone realized they were either looking at the most confident genius in galactic history or the most doomed being in the known universe. What followed was the kind of awkward silence usually reserved for family dinners and diplomatic incidents. Jake, apparently immune to social cues, continued munching his snack, while the other students exchanged the kind of meaningful looks that said, "Should we tell him, or just let natural selection handle this?" Zephyr was the first to crack. His tentacles began gesticulating wildly as he launched into what could only be described as a therapeutic info dump. "Last cycle, my study partner Blorgex went in there with a 4.7 GPA and came out speaking only in mathematical equations. He now works as a living calculator at the Intergalactic Revenue Service, and he weeps binary code." "Oh, that's nothing," Korak chimed in, apparently deciding that if they were sharing trauma, he might as well contribute. "My cousin's roommate's battle brother took the test 3 years ago. They found him 2 days later sitting in a corner, trying to solve the color blue. The doctors say he'll never be the same. He's open to meditation retreat and keeps insisting that the number 7 tastes like Thursday." Nixie's crystalline form shifted to what could generously be called panic violet. "The test doesn't just challenge your mind," she resonated ominously. "It challenges your concept of reality. Students have emerged believing they're made of cheese, or that gravity is just a suggestion, or that the entire universe is actually a really elaborate tax form." Jake looked up from his snack bag with the expression of someone who'd just been told that water was wet. "Huh, sounds like a Tuesday. Anyone got a pencil, though? I'm serious about the pencil thing." The group stared at him. Here they were, sharing their deepest academic anxieties and existential fears, and this bizarre little creature from the galactic equivalent of nowhere was worried about office supplies. "Jake," Zephyr said gently, his voice taking on the tone usually reserved for explaining death to small children. "The mind maze test is administered directly into your consciousness. There are no pencils, there is no paper, there is only you, alone in a psychic construct designed to push your cognitive abilities beyond their breaking point, while simultaneously forcing you to confront the fundamental meaninglessness of existence." Right, Jake nodded thoughtfully. "But like hypothetically, if I did have a pencil, would that be against the rules?" Before anyone could explain the concept of hypothetical questions to someone who clearly lived in a different universe, the chamber door hissed open. Professor Vex Thule emerged, looking like someone had taken the concept of stern academic authority and given it too many eyes and not enough patience for stupid questions. "Next group," the professor announced in a voice that sounded like gravel being sorted by a very disappointed machine. "I trust you have all prepared for the intellectual trial that awaits you. The mind maze has broken spirits, shattered egos, and sent more students into early retirement than the campus cafeteria's mystery meat." Jake raised his hand. "Quick question, is this going to take long? Because I've got a study group for xenobiology at 4, and we're covering the mating habits of Plutonian space whales." Professor Vex Thule's extra eyes all focused on Jake with the kind of attention usually reserved for particularly interesting specimens. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then pushed right through uncomfortable and into, someone should probably call security. Finally, the professor spoke. "Fascinating. We have an optimist." Walking into testing chamber Omega-7 was like stepping inside a kaleidoscope that had been designed by someone with a serious grudge against the laws of physics. The walls weren't just curved. They were curved in directions that didn't technically exist, creating angles that made your eyes water and your brain file a formal complaint with management. Floating geometric shapes drifted through the air like very pretentious butterflies, occasionally morphing into symbols that seemed to whisper things you definitely didn't want to hear. The floor was made of something that looked like crystallized starlight, if starlight could be deeply personally offended by your presence. In the center of it all sat what could generously be called chairs, though they appeared to have been designed by someone whose only experience with sitting involved balancing on the edge of a nightmare. "Please be seated," Professor Vextool announced, gesturing with appendages that probably had names in 17 different languages, none of them pleasant. "The mind maze will initialize momentarily. I recommend you make peace with whatever deities you worship, update your academic wills, and try not to think about the concept of up too hard, as it tends to get ideas." Zephyr immediately began what could charitably be called hyperventilating, though it sounded more like a deflating balloon orchestra. His tentacles had gone full pretzel mode again, and he was muttering what were either prayers or incredibly creative curse words in his native language. Korak, for all his warrior bravado, had gone the color of old cheese and was gripping his chair so hard that small stress fractures were appearing in the crystallized starlight. His usual confident posture had been replaced by the kind of hunched shoulders you typically see on someone waiting for particularly bad news from their doctor. Nixie had cycled through every color in the visible spectrum and had started inventing new ones. She was currently emanating something that could best be described as existential magenta, while making sounds like a very nervous wind chime in a hurricane. Jake, meanwhile, had settled into his chair with the casual ease of someone settling in for a movie. He'd somehow managed to make the impossible geometry look comfortable, and was still working his way through his snack bag. "So," he said conversationally, "does this thing come with instructions, or are we going full IKEA furniture assembly here?" The professor's multiple eyes performed what might have been a blink, if blinking involved that much judgment. "Mr. Thompson, the mind maze is a psychic construct that adapts to each individual's cognitive patterns. It will present you with challenges designed specifically to test the limits of your mental capabilities while simultaneously—" "Right, got it," Jake interrupted, crumpling up his empty snack bag and somehow making it disappear. "Custom difficulty settings. That's pretty cool, actually. Does it have save points?" Before anyone could explain the concept of existential terror to someone who clearly thought it was a video game, the chamber filled with a sound like the universe clearing its throat. The floating shapes began to pulse with light that wasn't quite light, creating patterns that made reality seem like more of a suggestion than a rule. "Initiating Mind Maze Protocol," came a voice that sounded like it was being transmitted through several dimensions and a broken telephone. "Subjects will now experience cognitive evaluation through direct psychic interface. prepare for... Oh, this is like one of those escape room things, Jake said brightly, as swirling energy began to envelop the group. I love puzzles. My grandma and I used to do the Sunday crossword together. She always said the trick was to not overthink it. The last thing the other students heard before reality dissolved around them was Jake muttering, let's see, 7 letters for interdimensional academic horror. Probably starts with a T. Tuesday? No, that's only 7 if you count the day part. And then everything became very, very interesting, in the way that ancient curses are interesting, which is to say, problematic for everyone involved. The mind maze didn't mess around with subtle psychological manipulation. It went straight for the jugular of existential terror with all the finesse of a cosmic sledgehammer. Zephyr found himself standing in what appeared to be his childhood spawning pool, except now it was filled with his worst fear. Standardized test forms, thousands of them, floating in the murky water like the world's most anxiety-inducing lily pads. Each form was slightly different, and he could hear the voice of his mother spawn echoing across the water. Did you remember to use a number 2 pencil equivalent? Did you fill in the bubbles completely? You know your spawning brother never had this much trouble with exams. The poor creature was practically vibrating with panic, his tentacles forming knots that would have impressed a sailor. I can't remember if the answer to question 47 was B or C. What if I marked it wrong? What if I've been marking everything wrong my entire academic career? Meanwhile, Korak had been dropped into what looked like his ancestral war hall, except instead of epic battles and glorious victories, it was filled with his worst nightmare, customer service representatives. Hundreds of them, all smiling that special customer service smile that said, I'm going to help you and you're going to hate every second of it. They were all holding clipboards and asking him to rate his experience on a scale of 1 to 10. Please hold while we transfer you to the appropriate department, they chanted in unison. Your call is very important to us. Did you try turning your warrior's pride off and on again? Korak, warrior of 1,000 battles, slayer of the dreaded beasts of Proxima Centauri, was curled up in a corner, whimpering. I just want to file a simple complaint about my weapon warranty. Why are there so many forms? Nixie's experience was perhaps the most abstract. She found herself in a realm where every surface was covered in interior design magazines from Earth, circa 1987. The walls were adorned with wood paneling, shag carpeting covered the floor, and everything was painted in colors that had names like Harvest Gold and Avocado Dream. For a being who existed as living crystalline beauty, it was like being trapped inside a Pinterest board created by someone with a serious grudge against good taste. The aesthetic dissonance is overwhelming, she wailed, her form cycling through colors that didn't exist in any catalog. How can beings live surrounded by such coordinated ugliness? And Jake? Jake was standing in what appeared to be his grandmother's living room, complete with the floral couch that nobody was allowed to sit on and the plastic-covered furniture that squeaked when you moved. The maze had clearly tried to make it terrifying by adding some floating geometric shapes and ominous whispers. But Jake just looked around, with the expression of someone who had found a $20 bill in an old jacket. Huh, he said, walking over to examine a floating cube that was pulsing with malevolent energy. Grandma would have loved this. She was always saying the living room needed more conversation pieces. He poked the cube, which responded with a sound like the universe having an anxiety attack. Oh, you're one of those worry cubes, aren't you? Like a stress ball, but with more existential implications. The cube, which was apparently a manifestation of pure cosmic dread, seemed to hesitate. This wasn't in its programming. Jake continued his casual exploration, treating the maze's psychological torments like he was browsing through a particularly interesting garage sale. Oh, and look at this, he said, approaching a swirling vortex of what appeared to be liquefied fear. It's like one of those lava lamps, but with more screaming souls. Very retro. He could hear his classmates struggling in their own nightmare scenarios, so he did what any reasonable human would do. He started offering advice like he was helping with homework. Hey, Zephyr, he called out, somehow managing to project his voice across dimensional boundaries. Stop overthinking the test forms. You know what my dad always said about multiple choice? When in doubt, pick C. It's statistically the most common correct answer because test makers are lazy. Zephyr's panic-induced tentacle nodding slowed slightly. But what if they're not lazy? What if they're trying to trick us by making B the most common answer? Then pick B, Jake replied cheerfully. Look, buddy, here's the thing about tests. They're made by people who put their pants on one leg at a time, just like everyone else. Well, assuming they wear pants. The point is, they're not cosmic entities of pure intelligence. They're just academics with too much time and not enough hobbies. From Korak's customer service hell came a confused grunt. But the forms! There are so many forms. Korak, my man, Jake said, somehow managing to sound like a life coach giving a pep talk. You've fought space dragons, you once arm wrestled a black hole, and won. You really gonna let a clipboard defeat you? Here's what you do. Just start filling out random forms. Make stuff up. Give yourself 5 stars for everything. What's the worst that can happen? But that would be dishonest, came Korak's weak reply. Buddy, you're trapped in a psychic maze that's trying to break your brain. I think we're past worrying about survey ethics. The most remarkable thing was that it was actually working. The maze, designed to exploit the deepest psychological weaknesses of advanced galactic civilizations, was completely unprepared for the human approach to problem solving, which could best be summarized as a good enough. Jake walked over to what appeared to be the maze's central processing core, a swirling mass of energy and mathematical equations that pulsed with the rhythm of a cosmic migraine. To anyone else, it would have been incomprehensibly terrifying. To Jake, it looked like a really complicated Sudoku puzzle. You know what your problem is, he said to the maze itself, settling down cross-legged in front of the cosmic horror like he was about to have a heart-to-heart with an old friend. You're trying too hard. You're like that teacher who makes tests so difficult that everyone fails and then acts surprised when the class average is 30%. The maze's pulsing slowed, as if it was actually listening. See, here's the thing about humans, Jake continued, pulling out what appeared to be a granola bar from somewhere. We're basically walking disasters. We evolved on a planet that's constantly trying to kill us. Our governments are run by people who probably shouldn't be trusted with houseplants. And we invented something called reality TV and then watched it voluntarily. You can't scare us with cosmic horror because Tuesday morning traffic is cosmic horror. The central processing core flickered uncertainly. This wasn't going according to any of its protocols. Jake took a bite of his granola bar and chewed thoughtfully while the cosmic horror that was the mind maze's sensual intelligence tried to process what was happening. It was like watching a supercomputer attempt to understand why humans put pineapple on pizza. Technically possible, but fundamentally confusing to any rational entity. You want to know what I think? Jake said, gesturing with his granola bar at the swirling mass of existential dread. I think you've been going about this all wrong. You're testing people like intelligence is some kind of perfect, crystalline thing that shatters when you apply pressure. But that's not how intelligence works, at least not for humans. The maze pulsed, and Jake could swear he heard something that sounded like "please explain," transmitted through 17 dimensions and filtered through a broken radio. Right, so here's the thing, Jake continued, settling in like he was about to give the galaxy's most casual TED Talk. You're designed by species that achieved interstellar travel through careful planning, logical progression, and probably a lot of really neat spreadsheets. But humans? We got to space because we looked at exploding rockets and said, yeah, but what if we sat on top of one? Around them, the maze's various torture scenarios were starting to malfunction. Zephyr's test forms were beginning to fill themselves out with answers like C, because why not? And this question is stupid, next. Korak's customer service representatives were getting confused by his new approach of rating everything as magnificent, regardless of what they were asking. Nixie's aesthetic nightmare was slowly being replaced by her own crystal form, imposing better color coordination on the hideous 1980 CES decor. See? You're testing for the ability to handle perfection under pressure, Jake explained, warming to his theme. But humans don't do perfection. We do good enough, and then we iterate. We fail spectacularly, learn something weird from the failure, and then try again, with more duct tape and less common sense. He stood up and walked closer to the processing core, which was now pulsing with what could only be described as confusion mixed with a tiny bit of curiosity. The thing is, you're not really testing intelligence at all. You're testing the ability to handle uncertainty and failure without losing your mind. And buddy, let me tell you something about humans and failure. Jake grinned, and somehow managed to make it look reassuring rather than terrifying, which was a neat trick when addressing a cosmic entity of pure academic frustration. We are spectacular at failure. We fail so often, and so creatively, that we've turned it into an art form. We have entire industries built around watching people fail entertainingly. We call it comedy, and we pay money for it. We've failed so much that we've developed an entire psychological framework for dealing with failure that basically amounts to, could be worse. At least it's not mundane. The maze's processing core was now cycling through colors that didn't have names, creating a light show that was part aurora borealis, part existential crisis. "You want to test real intelligence?" Jake asked, spreading his arms wide. "Test the ability to look at an impossible situation and say, 'Well, this is stupid, but let's see what happens if I try anyway.' Test the ability to fail, shrug it off, and immediately start planning the next attempt with whatever ridiculous resources you have available." Suddenly, Jake snapped his fingers, a sound that somehow echoed across multiple dimensions despite the complete absence of air in several of them. "That's it! That's what you've been missing! You've been testing people's ability to be right, but intelligence isn't about being right. It's about being wrong in interesting ways and then getting less wrong over time." The revelation hit the maze like a philosophical freight train. For eons, it had been measuring students against the impossible standard of perfection, breaking the spirits of brilliant beings who couldn't handle the pressure of never making mistakes. But here was this bizarre little creature from a backwater planet, treating cosmic horror like a particularly annoying homework assignment, and somehow making it work. "You know what the real test should be?" Jake asked, somehow managing to make eye contact with a multidimensional entity that technically didn't have eyes. "Give someone an impossible problem, watch them fail at it in creative ways, and then see if they can help their friends fail less spectacularly. That's intelligence. That's problem solving. That's what you actually want to measure." The maze made a sound like a cosmic light bulb turning on. If light bulbs existed in 17 dimensions and were powered by pure understanding, around them the nightmare scenarios were dissolving. Instead of being trapped in personalized hells, the students found themselves in what could best be described as cosmic study groups. Zephyr was no longer drowning in test anxiety. Instead, he was working through practice problems with the patient assistance of manifestations that looked suspiciously like friendly tutors. Korak wasn't being tortured by customer service. He was learning to navigate bureaucracy with the help of guides who actually wanted him to succeed. Nixie found herself not trapped in aesthetic hell, but in a design studio where she could experiment with color combinations and spatial arrangements, learning through play rather than suffering through judgment. "This is remarkable," came Zephyr's voice, no longer tinged with panic but filled with actual excitement. "I'm learning by doing, not just memorizing formulas. The bureaucratic processes actually make sense when someone explains them properly," Korak called out, sounding amazed. "I'm discovering new color harmonies I never imagined possible," Nixie chimed in, her form now cycling through patterns that were genuinely beautiful rather than stress-induced. Jake nodded sagely, like a teacher watching students finally grasp a difficult concept. "That's because you're not being tested anymore, you're being taught. And learning is supposed to be fun, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." The maze's central intelligence pulsed with something that felt like gratitude mixed with embarrassment, like a cosmic entity realizing it had been doing its job completely wrong for several millennia. "You know," Jake said conversationally, finishing his granola bar and somehow making the wrapper disappear into whatever interdimensional pocket he'd pulled the snack from in the first place, "I bet if you redesigned yourself as a learning environment instead of a testing gauntlet, you'd get way better results. Students would actually want to be here instead of requiring therapy afterward." The processing core brightened considerably, and Jake could swear he heard the cosmic equivalent of, "Why didn't I think of that?" echoing through dimensions that mathematics was still working on defining. The transition back to reality was surprisingly gentle, like waking up from a really good nap instead of being yanked out of a psychological blender. One moment they were floating in cosmic study groups having breakthrough learning experiences, and the next they were sitting in those impossible chairs in testing chamber Omega 7, blinking in what passed for normal light. Professor Vextool stood at the chamber's control panel, staring at a display screen with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had just been gently but firmly relocated to a different zip code. The screen was showing numbers that, apparently, shouldn't exist, at least not according to several fundamental laws of academic assessment. "This is," the professor began, then stopped, made a sound like a computer attempting to process poetry, and started again. "This is unprecedented." Zephyr looked around with the dazed expression of someone who had just discovered that the monster under the bed was actually really good at helping with homework. His tentacles were relaxed, for what was probably the first time since he'd enrolled at the academy. "I feel different. Like I understand things I didn't even know I didn't understand." Korak was flexing his muscles experimentally, as if testing to make sure they still worked after his brain had been upgraded. I solved 17 different bureaucratic scenarios and actually enjoyed it. I enjoyed paperwork. What has happened to me? Nixie was practically glowing, literally, since she was cycling through colors that looked like happiness had been translated into the visible spectrum. I learned 12 new approaches to spatial harmony, and I think I accidentally invented 3 new art forms. Jake stretched and yawned like someone who had just finished a particularly satisfying Sunday crossword. Nice. That was fun. Bit weird with all the cosmic horror aesthetic, but the core concept was solid. 7 out of 10. Would recommend. Professor Vextool's multiple eyes all focused on Jake with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing its own rules. Mr. Thompson, according to these readings, you achieved a score that technically exceeds the parameters of our measuring system. The Mind Maze's artificial intelligence is requesting to file a formal academic paper on your problem-solving methodology. Cool, Jake said, apparently unmoved by the fact that he had just broken the academic equivalent of the sound barrier. Can I get a copy? My mom likes to put my test scores on the refrigerator. The professor made another one of those computer processing poetry sounds. Furthermore, the Mind Maze has submitted a request to completely restructure its evaluation protocols, based on what it learned from observing your approach to cognitive challenges. That's nice, Jake replied, checking what appeared to be a primitive timepiece strapped to his wrist. Speaking of which, I should probably head out. Got that xenobiology study group in 20 minutes, and Professor Claxon gets really cranky when people are late. Plus, I still need to figure out how Plutonian space whales manage to mate in zero gravity without getting their tentacles tangled. It's apparently more complicated than you'd think. The sheer mundane normalcy of Jake's concerns seemed to break something in the professor's brain. Here was a being who had just revolutionized the entire concept of academic assessment, and he was worried about being late to study whale reproduction. Mr. Thompson, Professor Vextool said slowly, do you have any idea what you've accomplished here today? Jake paused at the chamber door and looked back with the expression of someone who genuinely didn't understand what all the fuss was about. I helped some friends with a group project, and maybe gave some feedback to an AI about user experience design? I mean, it wasn't rocket science. It was considerably more complex than rocket science, the professor replied faintly. Well, yeah, but rocket science is easy, Jake said with a shrug that somehow managed to encompass the casual dismissal of several advanced degrees worth of engineering knowledge. You just point the explodey end at the ground and the other end at where you want to go. The hard part is doing it without dying, but that's more of a safety issue than a science issue. Zephyr's tentacles performed what might have been the alien equivalent of a facepalm. Jake, how is it possible that you treat cosmic horror like a minor inconvenience, but consider your xenobiology study group a legitimate source of stress? Jake's face took on the expression of someone who had been asked to explain something so obvious that he wasn't sure where to start, because cosmic horror is just stuff trying to scare you. And most scary stuff stops being scary once you poke it a few times and realize it's just following a script. But Professor Claxon's exams? Those things are genuinely unpredictable. Last semester, he asked us to explain the mating rituals of energy beings, and then got mad when nobody mentioned their tax filing procedures. I still don't understand the connection. The professor's screen chose that moment to emit a sound like a cosmic notification ping. New text appeared on the display, written in what looked like the universe's most polite font. Fascinating, Professor Vextool read aloud. The Mind Maze AI has submitted a formal request for transfer to Earth. It wishes to study what it calls these impossible creatures in their natural habitat. It has also requested access to something called crossword puzzles and reality television for research purposes. Jake brightened considerably. Oh, it would love Earth. We've got this game show where people answer trivia questions while standing on platforms above a pool of green slime. It's called academic horror, but it's actually pretty fun. Way better than the genuine cosmic horror approach. It has also, the professor continued, looking like someone trying to translate a foreign language while having an existential crisis, submitted a proposal to redesign all academic assessments in the galaxy based on what it learned from observing human problem-solving techniques. That's probably a good idea, Jake said, nodding approvingly. You guys take education way too seriously. Learning should be fun. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts. He paused at the door and looked back at his classmates, who were still staring at him with the expressions of people who had just watched someone casually rewrite the laws of physics while eating a snack. Hey, if any of you want to join that study group, you're totally welcome. Fair warning, though, Professor Claxon has some very strong opinions about proper citation format, and he once made a student rewrite an entire paper because they used the wrong font for the footnotes. And with that, Jake Thompson, the human who had accidentally revolutionized galactic education by treating cosmic horror like a crossword puzzle, wandered off to worry about space whale reproduction and proper academic formatting. Behind him, the Mind Maze AI was already composing its transfer request to Earth, fascinated by the prospect of studying a species that had somehow turned existential dread into entertainment and made failure into an art form. Professor Vek's stool looked at the remaining students, then at the screen displaying Jake's impossible test scores, then back at the students. "Class dismissed," the professor said finally. "I need to lie down and contemplate the fundamental nature of intelligence for several hours, possibly days." As the students filed out, still buzzing with the afterglow of actually enjoying a learning experience, Zephyr turned to his classmates with wonder in all three of his eyes. "Do you think all humans are like that?" he asked. Karak, still flexing experimentally, shook his massive head. "I genuinely hope not. The universe isn't ready for more than one Jake Thompson." Nixie, cycling through colors that looked like contentment mixed with bewilderment, chimed in agreement. "One human who treats cosmic horror like a mild inconvenience is a miracle. 2 would probably break reality." None of them noticed the small notation that appeared at the bottom of Professor Vexhul's screen. "Exchange program expansion approved. Additional human students requested for advanced study." Somewhere in the depths of space, Jake Thompson was explaining to a group of increasingly fascinated alien students that the secret to understanding Plutonian space whale mating rituals was to remember that love finds a way, even in zero gravity, and that most biological processes made perfect sense once you stopped overthinking them. The galaxy would never be quite the same.